If you're a graphic designer watching this, I'm going to speak straight to you, right? And you understand what I'm talking about. The day to day of your work is either social media posts, it's banners, it's emailers, it's collaterals, which is you're making these collaterals, which you usually at a high frequency, like sometimes every day, sometimes every week, you have to keep making these. And this is actually really fun when you get started out. But after a point, you sort of hit this sort of saturation where you're like, I'm doing the same thing, just slightly different, and I'm doing the same thing every day.
Where you're already working, let's say, started out as a designer, and now you're planning to switch. And one of the most popular ones, I think, is from a graphic designer to a, what they call a UI UX designer, or just being a product
Yeah.
designer, interaction designer, or just designing digital products is what their intent is. So what, like, why do, in your experience and your conversations with all the designers, why do designers sort of want to do that? And what is then a good reason to do so, and what is not a good
Yeah.
reason? And when, like, what path could one follow to sort of make
Yeah.
that progress?
So if you're a graphic designer watching this, I'm going to speak straight to you, right? And you understand what I'm talking about. The day to day of your work is either social media posts, it's banners, it's emailers, it's collaterals, which is you're making these collaterals, which you usually at a high frequency, like sometimes every day, sometimes every week, you have to keep making these. And this is actually really fun when you get started out. But after a point, you sort of hit this sort of saturation where you're like, I'm doing the same thing, just slightly different, and I'm doing the same thing every day. A lot of graphic designers don't actually reach this point, and they keep exploring even further, and that is also totally okay. But a lot of graphic designers sort of reach this point where they're like, is this all graphic design has to offer? And when you do reach this point, it can be a sign that you're looking for something, for a outlet for your creativity that is outside just social media posts, banners, and collaterals. um, and the point is also that collaterals are usually one-off things which follow a similar brand style, versus when you're a UI UX designer, you're creating systems, which is sort of a big leg up from just designing collaterals, because now you have to think at a higher level. So that is actually a big challenge for creativity, because it requires you to think of more variables running together at the same time. So as a graphic designer, if that's a position you're in today, switching to UI UX design is actually a very viable thing for you, and it's going to be super simple for you, because the most challenging thing, which is figuring out tools or figuring out what a design process typically looks like, you already have some idea of that. It's just that instead of designing posters, let's say, you're designing screens. Now, as when designing a poster, there are certain things that go with it, which is the kind of colors you can use, the, let's say, the grid systems for posters, the kind of paper you print it on. Now, these are constraints to your design. For screens, there are other constraints, which is this iOS or Android? What part of the flow is it in? What's the purpose? Is there a, you know, click through rate you have to think about? So you are just getting used to designing, but for a new medium. This medium now is a digital, it's screens. So as a graphic designer, you're in a very good position. Start figuring out how you can start applying your creativity to this new medium.
Yeah, I think love that answer, and I completely agree with it. So I'm just gonna extend from where you left off, and and picking up from different medium. That's where I see most of the graphic designers trying to switch to digital designing for digital products. That's where they mostly fall off, and not understanding that the aesthetic sense changes, right? So following a similar path of trying to recreate the UI to understand, to get a sense of pattern. And since you're already a designer, you will pick up those patterns, right? What are the sensibilities of a digital product, and what are the sensibilities of a OS and a platform you're designing for? Is it web? Is it Android? Is it iOS? Is it, what platform are you designing for, and what kind of app you're designing for? you will also start to notice the kind of aesthetics, let's say a utility app has versus, let's say, a game has. And those are very two different kind of aesthetics, you will follow as a designer. So sort of following that same path really helps to pick up on the sensibilities. And another thing I think that I want to really emphasize is the way we think about design when we are graphic designer is like the kind of interaction and distance people are usually used to is very different. I mean, apart from social media posts, because they're consumed on mobile phone, but even there you're trying to get through a click through rate, and your area of influence is limited, and you don't think about something called states. That's going to be another platform, another pitfall where you're going to fall off, because we are used to, like, as social media, if you're designing creatives for that, we just put out one creative saying this is what it is, sale, this is the coupon if you want to follow. But if you were designing that digitally, uh, as a template, as a system, start thinking about systems, then you will need to design how many characters can this line actually hold, how big can the coupon code be, can you put like currency off or percentage off, and those kind of elements, right? So when you start to think about how to templatize, some of your designs, you will sort of start to get an idea of states, right? And states, what states are, for example, let's say you go to WhatsApp, right? What does a contact with whom you do have chats look like versus with whom you've not started chats? So those are two different states of the same element, or thing you're designing. So that is another thing that I have noticed personally, like graphic designers trying to switch over, like have that aha moment, like, oh, so
Yeah.
that's what I was missing, like that's where I was, why there was a lot of back and forth that was happening. And typography, like the type scale practiced in, like, when you're creating, doing print work or social media creative work even digitally, and the type scale practice like when doing product design or designing for digital media, it's very very different on that platform. So yeah, I think that's specifically about from graphic designers to UI UX designers. And then I think
Mm.
moving on to, like, a lot of UI UX designers are now getting interested in motion design,
Mm.
and what's up with that. And we also didn't talk about, I think it's important to talk about why graphic designers are wanting to switch to product design.
Mm.
Why do, in your observation, why do they want to switch?
I think it's just that graphic design can get boring for a lot of graphic designers,
Mm-hmm.
which is illustrators I've seen actually usually are really happy with illustrating, because there's just so much of, from my opinion, there's so much of depth to explore there.
Mm-hmm.
But in a lot of companies, graphic design only means like two, three things, right? And that can get very static. So I
Right.
think the biggest reason is that you get bored of applying your creativity this way, and
Mm.
you want to now apply it this way.
Right.
And then another reason then could also be money.
Right.
UI UX designers,
Right.
on an average, make a lot more money than than graphic designers.
Right.
Um, so that also can be a big motivating factor.
Right. And another trend I've seen, I think, is that graphic designers, if they want to make the same amount of money, they do well off to be freelancing and consulting. But to run that sort of show is not everybody's cup of tea, because it's really difficult to keep that clients flowing, follow up, and keep the deadlines yourself. At times, you need your, like, you do function better in a team sort of environment, and
Yeah.
that can get really difficult. Speaking of which, you pointed on a very interesting part that it can get boring, and that's why I think at Head Out, especially in our discussions of talking about the structure of the team, this is the point as well that came up, and that's where we were very specific about not having a graphic design team, but a
Mm.
visual communication design team, which is broad enough to cover a lot of non like digital and non-digital aspects of all sorts of
Yeah.
visual communication, including things like iconography is visual communication, right?
Mm.
So that's sort of like becomes a shared sort of area of, like, your work goes and becomes like this size of icon, that's the size of icon, so you're involved in a lot of layers. So
Yeah.
right now we have a bunch of interns, but like if you're watching this video and if you're interested in visual communication, should totally apply, because we're looking for folks who are interested in visual communication. Shameless plug, hashtag.
That's very interesting because for us, what we decided was to actually split the team,
Mm-hmm.
uh, and split the team way before it grew.
Mm-hmm.
So at some point, it was 8 people on the UI UX team and 8 people on graphic design. But
Mm-hmm.
we actually split way earlier, where it was about 2 and 2 or 3 and 3.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the reasons we did it was just that the pace of work was so different, which
Mm-hmm.
is um, the people who were doing graphics had to do like 2 or 3 things every single day, and then
Mm-hmm.
2 or 3 different things the next day, whether this was emails, banners, ads, social media. Versus for product designers, they were doing things on a slower time scale, which is maybe in a week you think about this one problem,
Mm-hmm.
or this bigger project that you're working on, which is like about 2 or 3 weeks maybe.
Right.
Um, so we did that, and then that did cause some problems initially when we split it,
Mm-hmm.
which is like coordination. And then um, designers like hanging out with other designers. You split the
Right.
teams now, and there's less
Right.
people you can hang out with.
Right.
But over time, what happened was when the teams grew in size, it actually became all okay,
Mm-hmm.
because then the graphic design team started looking like there were people who were doing just animation, like
Mm-hmm.
just motion design. There were
Mm-hmm.
people who were doing just, let's say, a lot of design ops work, which is
Right.
banners and ads kind of stuff. They got much closer with the YouTube team, which was making videos.
Right.
Um, because then they started making graphics for a lot of videos. Earlier, the YouTube team used to have difficulty pulling them away from the product team,
Right.
and then they got really close with the content teams. They got really close with the academic teams.
Mm-hmm.
So eventually, that sort of worked out.
Hey, that's kind of a nice idea. I think I'm gonna try some of that serendipity, kind of set that up environment for that to happen as an experiment,
Yeah,
because that makes complete sense. The better sense they have of the kind of content there's going in, and the kind of who are the people who are using their design and why they wanted getting them close to uh, that sort of feel. And an interesting thing that is, I mean, we do have that sort of split as well. I mean, there are designers who solely focus on visual communication, but again, the split is
mm,
between like eventually your team evolved to visual communication, which does involve a lot of digital, product design work, or let's say a lot of work that overlaps multiple mediums, right? Which will be used from a social media creative. And even with social media creative, now we're trying to approach, because the kind of with multiple languages, etc., and kind of experiment that we have to run, we are trying to approach that with the design system point of view as well, where after creating X number of creators, we try to create a system out of it and see if that can be standardized, and then see that humans only need to review for quality
mm,
standards, right? Once in a while, instead of like sitting down and creating, just removing the redundancy and manual
yeah,
labors. Instead, the graphic designers, or let's say the visual communication designers, in our case, are now thinking about what alternate styles could they experiment with, right? How could they, what could they actually test to see whether this works? So we start asking
yeah,
questions from their designs, and what data they are looking at, and start looking at on that trajectory, instead of just being in that circle. It's kind of it's very difficult, because the requirements in visual communication are always so unique. Like, this
yeah.
banner never ever looks like that banner, right? But over time you can roughly develop a rough sense of things, a starting point at least, which
Yeah.
then can be worked on.
What's also really hard is, as a design manager, it's really hard to give feedback to graphic design teams as well as product design.
Oh yeah.
Because for product design, the kind of feedback you need to give is more systemic, maybe a longer term thing, because
Hmm.
their timelines are bigger. Versus for graphic design, feedback is now. You
Hmm.
need to do this today.
We
So
had to
one of
we had to post this like yesterday. That's always going back.
yeah. And then also another thing that helped for us was moving to Figma, which
Mm.
is initially, since the graphic design team was all using Illustrator,
Mm-hmm.
um, there was complete um, there was a complete disconnect where we didn't know what they were working on.
Mm-hmm.
But once they actually moved to Figma, they were like, "This is so much better than Illustrator."
Right.
That's when we started having closer communication, even though we sat apart,
Right.
because you were all now in the same tool. And that's when they started exploring a lot of design systems.
Mm-hmm.
Like, there was this one thing where we had to generate like 1,000 posters with a person's name, with data, how many minutes they watched and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And since they weren't Figma, they just used a Figma plugin, connected it to Google Sheets and just ran this.